So, I've been on record for shilling on Final Fantasy XVI before in my video How Not to Review a Game. In that video, I basically said that the lack of RPG elements in Final Fantasy XVI is due to the change in direction of the gameplay and combat, because they have Ryota Suzuki as the combat director, who is famously known for directing the combat in Devil May Cry. Personally, the context here is pretty evident that Final Fantasy XVI would have a lot of RPG elements stripped out, but apparently not a lot of people are willing to accept that, and it is understandable, doubly so that Final Fantasy has always been a JRPG franchise. So today, I'm putting Final Fantasy XVI in retrospect by introducing you to another game that was just released this year that I would think is very similar to Final Fantasy XVI, but is executed much better in the combat gameplay aspect. Introducing Granblue Fantasy Relink. The year is 2016. The gacha game Granblue Fantasy is on its second anniversary, being very successful as one of the largest gacha games in the world. As an effort to branch out to other demography of players and to expand the universe of Granblue Fantasy, they announced a project for a console game called Granblue Fantasy Project Relink. It is teased as an action game with real-time combat in contrast to Granblue Fantasy's originally turn-based combat, and is a collaboration with Platinum Games, a game studio famously known for its stellar action combat. Down the line, the project will have more confirmations like in E3 2018, Granblue Fantasy Project Relink will have a Western release and is renamed to just Granblue Fantasy Relink. Then unfortunately in 2019, it was announced that Platinum Games would leave the development of Granblue Fantasy Relink, leaving the rest of the development to in-house Cygames. Platinum Games leaving the development plus the eventual COVID pandemic would heavily impact the development of Granblue Fantasy Relink, as it is indefinitely delayed to a far future. Thankfully, Granblue Fantasy Relink is finally free from development hell and is finally released on PlayStation and Steam in 2024. So, how was the game? Granblue Fantasy Relink is an action RPG that has very similar combat with Final Fantasy XVI. It is mostly a hack-and-slash action combat with the addition of skills to cast that operates on cooldown. At first, Granblue Fantasy Relink plays like a normal story-based JRPG. It is a linear progressing game that follows the flow of the story that it is trying to present. Along the way, encountering bosses to fight, which is where the selling point of the game is. And let me say this one bit, the boss battles are amazing in Granblue Fantasy Relink. You know how Final Fantasy XVI's boss battles are regarded as one of the most epic boss battles in recent games? I personally think that Granblue Fantasy Relink rivals that to some extent. The set pieces, the gimmicks, and even the music were amazingly crafted into stellar boss battles. From start to end, it is purely fun and engaging, pretty much having a lot of similar experience with Final Fantasy XVI, a great action combat against bosses as their main selling point. After the main story of Granblue Fantasy ends, however, the game actually starts to ramp up. You see, I haven't actually told you the main format of the gameplay loop is, because it is more akin to Monster Hunter with their mission-based gameplay loop. The mission-based gameplay loop is an addition that is mainly played after the story ends to add extra content to the game in a great way. At first, There are some small things like defeat the goblins, defend the crystals, or something like that, but much later to the progress, you will eventually fight more of the bosses that you fought in the story, plus more bosses that you will encounter exclusively from this mission-based gameplay loop format. This is where Granblue Fantasy Relink, in my opinion, heavily shines brighter than Final Fantasy XVI. My biggest criticism on Final Fantasy XVI would be that Final Fantasy XVI's content is somewhat limited to the main story and the sub-stories, making the game very limited in content, which results in no replayability for the game. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that the combat gameplay of Final Fantasy XVI, while fantastic and fun, is kind of a waste for not having it replayable outside the main and sub-story, or even the New Game Plus. I feel like since Final Fantasy XVI has a hub world similar to Granblue Fantasy Relink, where you manage everything you have at the moment, Final Fantasy XVI should also have some sort of mission system as well. Final Fantasy XVI kinda has that system already with the Notorious Hunt system for Notorious Marks, but the Notorious Hunt system poses two deal breakers. The first problem is that the system doesn't allow you to instantly fight the Notorious Marks. You have to accept the hunt details, then go to the huge semi-open world of Final Fantasy XVI, search for the marks based on the details that you gathered, and then once you find them, you fight them. While in contrast with the mission-based system in Granblue Fantasy Relink or even Monster Hunter, it is limited to a set of area, making it a more streamlined experience. The second deal breaker is that there's almost no real reason to fight them after the first hunt. They don't give you any additional material to farm on repeat, making them very limited in content both in the combat itself and the equipment that could have been made from that system as drops or crafting from materials, hence the lack of RPG elements in Final Fantasy XVI. Contrast that to Granblue Fantasy Relink, however, there are a lot of things that you would want to gather from the missions, from materials to upgrade a character's weapon, up to sigils and mastery points to further build your characters. To explain sigils and mastery points, I have to introduce you to the many RPG mechanics of Granblue Fantasy Relink and how it can be an example of how Final Fantasy XVI can improve their game by reintroducing RPG mechanics in that game. Granblue Fantasy Relink features 19 characters plus 2 more in the April update for you to pick and play for a party of 4 characters. The best thing about this is that the characters are not a copy-paste from one another. Everyone has their own set of attacks, skills, gimmick, mastery tree, and weapons, making the experience of the game a powerhouse of an RPG. Take for example the main character. The main character is a standard action-based hack-and-slash character at first, with their light attacks that can be finished with heavy attacks called Combo Finisher. However, further down the line, you'll notice that the main character didn't only have that, they have this thing called Arts Level, and it raises every time you do a combo finisher. This Arts Level then contributes to the main character's skill, in the first case with Regen Lave, a damaging projectile skill. The Arts Level increases the damage of Regen Lave. This is where it starts to get interesting, because then you realize after progressing the story and leveling up a bit, the main character has 16 total skills in their mastery tree, which is where mastery points come into play. You of course still need to pick 4 out of that 16, but the vast amount of choices that you can pick from the skills itself is amazing. There are offensive skill choices that decreases the enemy's attack and defense, so you can make the main character more of a damage dealer combatant, or you can put every skill to supporting buffs and debuffs, with attack up to the entire party, or even defensive damage cut skill and a healing. The amount of roleplay capabilities are abundant, and it doesn't end on the main character only. One character that I started using outside of the main character when I'm leveling up is Catalina. Catalina has a very similar gimmick with the main character, revolving around executing combo finishers to fill up a meter called Ares Gauge, and when filled, Catalina will call Ares to aid her in dealing more damage with her attacks and amplifying skills. Catalina at first feels like a very versatile combatant, having healing and defense buffs to aid the party, but as I learn her gimmick as I use her, Catalina is more of a very high damage dealer whenever Ares is summoned, and you can manipulate how long Ares is summoned while in battle. So what I did on building Catalina is to put highly offensive sigils and a sigil to passively give Stout Heart on Catalina to prevent her from being interrupted while she is executing a combo. Might not be the most optimal build because she will probably die a lot when hit, but it is how I found fun on the RPG mechanics on Granblue Fantasy Reeling. Because with this, there's freedom in building your character from what you found while trying a character. Furthermore, I have another character that I end up using more often at the near endgame, Rakam. Rakam is a ranged damage dealer, shooting with a gun. His light attack is a rapid fire, while the heavy attack is a high damaging charge attack that deals more damage the longer it is charged. He also has a heat gauge gimmick that fills up every time he attacks that isn't the charge attack. What it did is that the higher the heat gauge is, the faster the charge rate of the charge attack is, making him dish out more damage faster. So Rakam's gimmick is more so on the charge attack mechanic because his light rapid fire attack isn't very damaging while the charge attack deals a lot more damage, and everything on his base gimmick revolves around the charge attack. This is not to mention that Rakam has a skill that locks the hit gauge to the maximum, while also increasing attack and crit rate in exchange for his defense, making his charge attack a powerhouse of a damage dealer. So what I did with Rakam is to make him as much as a glass cannon as possible with the sigil system, putting amplifications in attack, crit, and more, while sparing some for reducing aggro so Rakam won't die too easily. That being said, I will also use Rakam's skill called Duration, which is an amazing defensive skill to dodge whatever attack coming towards him. Furthermore, Rakam also has double tap skill, which increases the overall damage dealt of the light rapid fire attack in case I want the light attack to be more impactful. Do you see how much role-playing potential in this? This aspect is what I am hooked to in Granblue Fantasy Reeling, and I think these features could have been in Final Fantasy XVI as well. In Final Fantasy XVI, you can only play as Clive Rosfield, the main character of that game. While he is very fun to play and has a lot of power potential due to the icon system, in reality, I will only stick to one set of skill loadouts that I am comfortable with throughout the game. Personally, I love Titan's skills, which mostly revolve around being able to parry and counterattack because I feel like Clive is the type of character that goes in the front line. I was hyped when I learned that I can get Bahamut's icon later on, but it was met with disappointment because the skills are pretty underwhelming and does not fit for Clive's playstyle in my opinion, because Bahamut's skills are like for magic casters that plays in the backline shooting magic spells at the enemy. But due to story reasons, I definitely can see why they do it like that. So what I think that could help a lot in encouraging more playstyles between icons is to let us have a robust party system like Granblue Fantasy Reeling. I think that an editable party system in terms that you can equip something to your party members or make them learn some skills is one step in the right direction. This is because right now, party members in Final Fantasy XVI are there, but they don't seem to do a lot. The only thing that I remember from commanding Torgal is to sick him, and I'm not sure what that does. I could imagine with some equipment to Torgal, I could choose to equip more aggro-oriented equipment to Torgal so I can pick Bahamut's icon as a fantasy of being the spellcaster instead. That's one of the examples that I can think of from this system. Also with all of these, plus points if the party members themselves are playable characters as well, just like in Granblue Fantasy Reeling. Final Fantasy as a franchise has been no stranger to compelling cast of characters outside of the main character. In Final Fantasy XVI, the case is still the same, but as mentioned before, they aren't very noticeable while in combat. I would think that making them playable makes the players care more about these characters. The best examples of this would be within the Final Fantasy franchise itself. Say Final Fantasy VII with the newly released Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. People would care more of the other characters other than Cloud, not just because they are compelling characters, but also partially because you can play as them. I would imagine that while in the story in Final Fantasy XVI, being able to play as Cid or Jill would be really cool. They would have their specific style of gameplay with their icon abilities. This shouldn't be limited to party members that only have icons either. I could imagine having the ability to play as Torgal or Gav would be really cool to have. That way, Final Fantasy XVI would have redeemed the character part of the character action hack and slash genre. With all that said, I still personally like Final Fantasy XVI as it is. The gameplay is the main selling point of the entry, and to me, that is enough for me to enjoy the game. That being said, with me playing Granblue Fantasy Relink recently, it made me think that Final Fantasy XVI could have been a better product. To make this clear, I didn't think that suddenly this makes Final Fantasy XVI hot garbage. This is a criticism made out of my love for both Final Fantasy XVI and Granblue Fantasy Relink. Granblue Fantasy Relink isn't the perfect action RPG game either. It still has some flaws here and there, but it contains several blueprints of what could have been the perfect Final Fantasy XVI. I'm pretty sure there are a lot more that I can take from Granblue Fantasy Relink for Final Fantasy XVI's improvement, but for now, these are my first impressions on this case. Thanks for watching.